So, Aaron, you have a really great piece at The Nation, and I'm like really happy and impressed and kind of surprised that you're able to publish it there or anywhere. It's did Trump bomb Syria on false grounds? The American media is ignoring leaks from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons that suggests a whitewash. So, please, can you tell us? Not only the story, but I guess how you came to write about it and if it was hard to get it published.
Well, it wasn't easy to get it published. And I think the fact that The Nation published it was an act of courage on their part. But it shouldn't be, because it's a really well-sourced article. It's based on whistleblowers, and it's challenging a guy named Donald J. Trump and one of the most serious decisions that he has made so far, which is launch military strikes on another country, on Syria, this time in April 2018. And it's an amazing story that's been totally silenced in the US media, including on the progressive adversarial left. And so, but it shouldn't be when you look at it, because basically what it is in April 2018, you have the Syrian government accused of committing a chemical attack in the town of Douma, which is just outside of Damascus. Syria was in a very vicious fight with a militia called Jaish al-Islam, which controlled Douma at the time and is backed by Saudi Arabia. And just as it was about to retake Douma, you had the Syrian government being accused of committing a chemical attack, which on its face didn't really make a lot of rational sense, because for Syria to do that, they'd be doing the one thing that would be triggering the red line that basically guarantees U.S. military intervention. Because, Trump a year before, pretty much that almost to the day, Trump had bombed Syria based on another allegation of a chemical weapons attack. So Trump bombed Syria without producing any evidence, and pretty much everybody goes along with it. Nobody in Congress, except for Tulsi Gabbard, I think, voices any skepticism. The whole media, they pause their, the resistance, Trump bashing, to like celebrate Trump, and because this is when they back him, is when he bombs other people, and this is when and then now there's already some reasons to doubt the allegation, including just from like a rational sense, it makes no sense. And then you also have some witnesses saying that it was not a chemical attack, and you have footage of a hospital scene that looks like it's been staged. But anyway, all that gets sort of put aside when about a year later, in March 2019, the OPCW, after sending in an investigation team into Douma a week or so after the alleged attack, the OPCW comes out with a report saying that, yeah, there are reasonable grounds to believe that a chemical weapons attack occurred. And that's taken to be pretty much substantiation and a justification for Trump's attack. Then, though, we get a bunch of leaks, and we show that internally, the investigators who actually went to Douma inside the OPCW reached a far different conclusion. And basically, their conclusions were censored, and they were drastically rewritten by their superiors, who basically kicked them to the curb, excluded them from the process, and produced a report that fit a narrative to make, to suggest that a chemical attack had occurred, when in fact the evidence that the investigators had collected had found the exact opposite. And so the leaks have been coming out slowly since May of 2019. And you look at the media coverage, and there's just been nothing, absolutely nothing. It's been a total wall of silence. And we can talk about why, but to me, it's one of the most extraordinary instances of manufacturing consent that I can recall. Because, look, I wasn't there, so I can't, and I'm also not a scientist.
Right.
But the point is, you have people inside the OPCW who are saying that their findings were far different than what was put out. And by the way, they also say that all of this came under U.S. pressure, where right before the OPCW put out their interim report on this in July of 2018, shortly after the alleged attack, they had a visit from a delegation from the U.S. government, which basically told them, you're going to have to come to this conclusion. There was a chlorine attack. This is why. And it was a really dubious presentation that they gave, that the scientists at the OPCW were not convinced by, and more importantly, thought was totally inappropriate interference, because under the Chemical Weapons Convention, state parties are not allowed to interfere in investigations. That's the whole point of groups like the OPCW. They're supposed to be independent and impartial and free of interference. And they also felt as if this put them actually in danger, because these U.S. officials met face-to-face the inspectors who were carrying out the investigation, which is also unprecedented. It's a complete violation of their confidentiality rights. And the reason why that's important is because there's a history of the U.S. bullying and threatening the OPCW, namely when Jose Bustani, the OPCW's first director general, during the lead up to the war in Iraq, he was negotiating inspections with Baghdad that were getting in the way of the Bush administration's drive to war. So John Bolton, when he was serving under Bush, threatened Bustani and even said to him, we later found out, that we know where your kids live. And they forced out Bustani and forced him to resign.
John Bolton said that?
John Bolton said that, yeah. And lo and behold, now it's interesting because now, fast forward to 2018, John Bolton's first day on the job comes right after Syria is accused of this chemical attack. And John Bolton writes in his new memoir that he oversaw the Trump administration's military planning for bombing Syria. And his only criticism of Trump is that Trump didn't order a wider attack on Syria in response. And Jose Bustani, meanwhile, he also resurfaces because he takes part in a panel that heard from one of the whistleblowers and heard their evidence. And Bustani said that he was very troubled by what he saw. And basically he thinks the OPCW has been compromised. And, that's a very serious thing to have the world's top chemical weapons watchdog used as an instrument to justify the military strikes and the proxy wars of the world's top superpower.
So how did these leaks come out and how did you access them?
Well, so you have, in the leaks, we see that there was this massive internal struggle where the scientists who went to Duma, and there's two of them who spoke out. There are others that were there, but the ones who were most forceful in speaking out were there. One of them is, we know his name. His name is Ian Henderson. The other one is not identified. His name is Inspector B. That's how the OPCW identifies him. And these leaks show that these guys struggled to get their findings heard internally, but they never went public. And finally, in March of 2019, the OPCW put out this final report. And, and when the Duma investigators, the ones that were left, because at that point, Inspector B was no longer, his tenure had expired by then. But when that happened, both Henderson and Inspector B spoke out internally and tried to get the Director General to listen to the evidence that was excluded and say, listen, we were there for this investigation and there was fraud. I want you to know about it. But they were basically shut down. And sometime after that, in May of 2019, the first leak occurred. We don't know from who, but somebody from inside the organization leaked a report that Henderson had written, basically concluding that whereas the public final report had concluded that it was quite likely these gas cylinders that were found in Duma came from a military aircraft, Henderson had actually written that it's quite more likely that it's the exact opposite, that the cylinders were manually placed, suggesting that the whole thing was staged on the ground to help trigger a U.S. military strike. And Henderson's report also referred to the fact that the OPCW had relied on, quote, supposed experts, which basically meant that he was, if you read between the lines, he was saying that after excluding their own scientists, the OPCW needed somewhere else to justify the narrative they wanted. So they turned to the outside and got some unnamed and, we don't even know who they are and what they did. They got them to produce basically some junk science to justify the narrative that they wanted to go with.
And this was
in terms of how I got them, I've been leaked some stuff as this story has escalated in recent months, and I've written a lot about it at the Gray Zone, and but that's all I can say about it. I think I got it because I was one of the few journalists to pay attention to this story, and I've been covering it nonstop because to me it's so important for obvious reasons.
And have there been other attempts to write about this? I know that there was someone at Newsweek.
There's a guy named Tariq Haddad who was working at Newsweek, and he as the leaks were coming out, he went to his editors and wanted to write this story, and they refused. And so he quit in protest, which is, quitting a media job. That's a bold move because there are not too many of them.
Right.
And if you look at the way the media has covered this, the only time a reporter from the New York Times has mentioned this story, it came once, and it came buried in a profile of this group, Bellingcat, which is like a Western state-funded outlet that purports to do open source investigations, but I think really just exists to justify, whatever fashionable Western narratives there are of the day, such as, for example, justifying intervention in Syria. And so it's buried at the bottom of this profile, and they mention this scandal, and they reduce like all these emails and reports and documents that have come out. The Times describes it as an email from an investigator, as if that's like the sum total of what has come out, and that was their only mention of it so far.
And not as like a leak.
Not well. I mean, it was they might have called it a leak, but it's like the point is we have like the original report that was suppressed, and then was censored by OPCW superiors. We have all these documents. We have there's meetings of a toxicology session where these expert toxicologists say that the symptoms observed are totally inconsistent with a chlorine attack, which is what was ultimately alleged by the U.S. and the OPCW. And so we have this trove of leaks. The Times describes it as one email, from an investigator. So it's like, and otherwise it's been complete silence, just total silence.
And it's so dangerous because, I mean, if people who even talk about this are dismissed as conspiracy theorists, crazy, fringe, whatever, it's this cycle where no one else will report on it. And so it becomes that much more fringe, right? Like it looks that much more fringe because everyone else is afraid to do it. And then this is an example of like, we should be skeptical of stuff like this, especially if Cheeto Mussolini, erratic, like we don't want him to be launching wars or dropping missiles places. Like, again, it's just like this mania, this like, it's almost like a magic, the way that people manage to get mad at Trump for the exact opposite things of the things that they should be mad at him about. And then when there's actually a smoking gun potentially about something that actually is bad, no one says anything. And if you suggested a report on it, you're a conspiracy theorist.
100%. And, I experienced this in trying to point out the actual facts of Russiagate and trying to push back on the dominant narrative by pointing out all the countervailing evidence that was just being ignored in the service of the fashionable narrative. And, it was even harsher if you look at the issue of Syria, where you have since 2012 about the U.S. spends hundreds of millions of dollars on a proxy war. The New York Times calls it the most expensive covert operation in U.S. history. Sending weapons and support into a country in support of so-called rebels that are fighting a government that the U.S. wants to overthrow. The weapons and support ultimately ends up benefiting jihadist groups, especially Al-Qaeda. And those who tried to challenge that and challenge all the core narratives that were used to justify this proxy war, I mean, them, Rania Khalek and Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal and others were just harassed and tormented. And they were the ones dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And really, they were just trying to document accurately the destruction of a country because the U.S. wanted to overthrow its government for its own reasons. And we see that now, even in a case where you have, documents coming, this extraordinary story where you have, it's like, this is not a matter of like, someone's analysis or speculation. These are documents from inside the world's top chemical weapons watchdog,
right?
Documenting a deception and a cover up, and not even that can get into the mainstream, and not even that can get into like left liberal publications. So The Intercept, for example, has published a bunch of stories pushing the pro-war narrative that the Syrian government was guilty. They haven't even acknowledged the whistleblower's existence. Same thing pretty much with Democracy Now! They did one segment on this, and that segment they did was with the guy who tried to dox one of the whistleblowers, who was like their guest was this guy Brian Whitaker, who's an apologist for the Syria proxy war. So
did they let him dox the person on the show?
No, he didn't dox him on the show. But the point is, like, it speaks to how effective, unfortunately, proxy war propaganda has been. And listen, I'm even victim to this. I was convinced in the early years of the Syrian war, like I went along with this, and so did some of my colleagues too, because like people are rising up against a tyrant. I mean, like why not support that? But then you learn the actual facts, that it's not just the question of peaceful protests being brutally cracked down. I mean, that happened, but it's not just that. It's also the U.S. and its Gulf allies and Turkey letting like tens of thousands of jihadists from around the world enter the country, flooding them with weapons, arming sectarian militias that want to kill Christians and Alawites and Shia, and destroying a country. And the same. It's not that unlike Afghanistan in the 1980s, but people on the left got co-opted into supporting that.
Right.
To the point where even now, where the war is basically over, but it's still hard to challenge the core narratives. And one of those narratives are things like Assad is such a demonic monster that he commits these irrational chemical weapons attacks. And that is what is used to justify U.S. military intervention, to overlook the massive U.S. Spending that went into the proxy war, and to help justify ongoing economic terrorism, basically, which is strangling Syria and strangling Syrian civilians for the fact that their government won the proxy war. So now the U.S. has imposed its most crippling sanctions on Syria to date, and things like these chemical weapons attack allegations are used in support of that narrative. And look at the scale of opposition. Like, we're killing Syrian kids, and we're denying them food and medicine. We're crippling the Syrian healthcare system, which was once the envy of the region before the war. Why? Because they beat our side in the proxy war. And look at the scale of congressional and media opposition. It's like, it's not even discussed.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, when I tweeted this out that you were coming on the show, of course, there was one of the regulars who I guess follows my tweets a lot, follows my work. He must have some kind of tool that finds like when you're tagged, or no, you probably retweet, and that's how he saw it. But he was like, said to Nina Turner, like, do you know that you're going to be on the show with like genocide deniers? So they're very, they do their homework.
It's funny if you look at their reaction. Nobody submits a correction to the nation. Nobody even tries to offer a substantive response. All they can do is call names and accuse you of being a genocide denier and a sadist. And it's like, that's all they can do. And all they can do is try to bully people into silence. But, and that works on some people. And it might even have worked on me in the past, maybe, because it's just like, but it's so vicious. But in this case, like, the facts are just overwhelming, and they're laid out, and nobody can challenge them. And that's been the case if you look at all the reporting that my colleagues at the Gray Zone did. I mean, if you look at all the stuff they did, they've been completely vindicated constantly. And they were subjected to like just the most ridiculous smear campaign and constantly attacked. And I don't see anybody apologizing for any of it. And it's amazing to witness, but at a certain point you stop caring about name calling.
Right. Well, anything else you want to talk about? I mean, we can talk. I always have fun talking with you, so
yeah.
I don't want
to. I think I've talked a lot about Syria, and I appreciate the chance to talk about it. I actually wanted to say one thing about Michael Brooks.
Yeah, of course.
Which is that I only met him twice, but just having met him twice, I got I saw what a special person he was. And I'm really just, I'm sad for his loved ones, for his coworkers, and I'm sad for the left because he was special. He offered something really special. He was really smart. He was really thoughtful. He was so funny. He did this impression of Chris Matthews that I saw live at the Bell House when he appeared at the Rising live show. It was so funny, and I just think that we've lost someone really special on the left, who's someone who we can't replace. And so I just wanted to send my condolences to his loved ones and just say what a loss this is for everybody.
Yeah, it's really shocking. And he's someone who people are used to hearing all the time, especially if they listen to or watch his show or the Majority Report. And yeah, we did a thing last week, Nando and I, and we did a little thing of spontaneous thing of Brian Williams. We were talking about how Nando, because Nando does a Chris Matthews thing too, and because they used to do a Chris Matthews on Chris Matthews thing, and he was saying, you know, he can't not think of him now when he does the Chris Matthews impersonation, and then we spontaneously transitioned, I don't remember why, into a Brian Williams impersonation that Nando does. Really pretty funny impersonation.
He could have had an entire other career in comedy.
I know.
He was that gifted. And
yeah.
It's rare. I mean, you know, leftists, in my experience, are often not that funny, you know?
Yeah, it's true.
And he was able to be like a really committed leftist and also just like not take himself seriously and be hilarious. And that is, I mean, he was special. And also he was deep, you know, he was spiritual. And when I saw him last, we talked a little bit about that. And I saw just what a rich and deep and thoughtful person he was. And I also learned after he died that he came from a very low income background. He grew up on food stamps, which in itself, like to like make it in lefty media, to like come from like such a background is all the more impressive because, you know, like in my case, I can afford to speak honestly about things because I know that no matter what, I'll always have a family that backs me up. You know what I mean? But so to learn that Michael came from that kind of background and was able to establish himself like this and establish a real following. He has friends all over the world. I just thought it was like just that much more impressive because there's a price to pay for being a leftist and for having integrity. And sometimes it's only people who can afford to do it that really, you know, can last and sustain themselves. But he really built something. He built a following and a community, and that on its own is such an achievement. And it's just you know, we're never going to forget him. He was really, really special.
And he was so young, but he also like has an entire archive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like so sad and tragic and there's so much more to do. But like, I keep thinking it's like it's not like solace, but maybe it is some solace. It's like that there is that. I mean, that there's like it's so sad because the person's not here anymore, but there is this automatic legacy. Mm-hmm. Like very tangible legacy. I mean, it's not, I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying, well, it's just like, yeah.
Yeah. And people can watch that archive.
Right.
And they can take him with us. You know, we can capture what we can of his spirit and take it with us in our work, his internationalism, his humor. You know, he really wanted to unite different factions of the left. You know, that's something he talked about because, you know, I'm associated with a faction of the left at the gray zone that like fights with others. And he really wanted to like, you know, unite everybody and stop, you know, and, you know, sometimes I don't think that's possible. I think you have to have certain fights, but he really wanted to overcome pettiness. And, you know, there's so much in his body of work that we can all learn from. And there's so much of it. The guy was so prolific.
I know. Yeah. And you, Aaron, I was going to like wish you a happy, I don't know how the segue now, but I do want to congratulate you on your year.
Yes.
Your year long, the birthday of Pushback.
Yes.
How long has it been around your show? How long has it been around?
It's been around for a year ago since last week.
Wow.
And for that, I'm very thankful to Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone, who made it all possible, and Ben Norton, my colleague there, who wrote the theme song and is incredibly helpful. And yes, and my other colleague, Anya, hosts another show called Red Lines. And we're doing great. You know, it's cool. Like, it's really nice to like work with a group I'm so aligned with, and we we can do it. You know, we have independence, which I've never really had at this level before. So it's great, and we're gonna keep pushing back.
Yeah, great. Yeah, keep pushing back. No shade of gray or red lines. Yeah. Well, Aaron, thank you again so much, and everyone check out Aaron's work, and I'll put links to it. And Yeah. Congrats to Aaron. Congrats to the Gray Zone. And yeah, come back.
I will happily come back. Thank you for having me, Katie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Bye.
Okay. Bye.